She undoubtedly manipulated him and used and exploited his weaknesses.
He isn't guessing. He was told. And what he was told is a great deal worse than manipulation.
Helped by others on the inside, that she really thought she, rather than Kate, should be the next queen after Charles. She couldn't understand why she, better looking and, in her view, more intelligent and harder working and everything, should be the queen.
She wanted the crown. The palace knew. They warned the queen.
Kate could see quite immediately that Meghan was furious that they were living in a small house in Kensington Palace compared to the sumptuous.
For years, one glittering royal object supposedly represented something Meghan believed was still waiting for her. A crown tied not merely to ceremony, but to rank, belonging, and a future inside the monarchy. Then, Tom Bower raised a possibility that changed the meaning of everything. The crown was never just about diamonds. In the world Meghan entered, jewels could carry messages more powerful than speeches. A tiara could signal trust. A necklace could connect one generation to another. A historic piece could quietly reveal who stood closest to the heart of the institution, and who remained outside its most protected traditions. That was the dangerous part. Nothing needed to be promised openly for expectations to begin taking shape. When Meghan joined the royal family, the public saw glamour, ceremonies, titles, and extraordinary access. But behind that polished surface existed another system entirely, a hierarchy built over generations, governed by precedent, rank, duty, and rules outsiders might never fully understand. The closer she moved toward the center of royal life, the more those invisible boundaries would have mattered. In that environment, it was easy to imagine how one particular crown could become more than an object. It could represent permanence, acceptance, proof that Meghan had not merely married into the family, but had secured a lasting place within its history. And if she believed that such a future was possible, every symbolic gesture could have strengthened that belief. But royal jewelry does not always follow emotion. It follows tradition. Ownership can be complicated. Access can change. Pieces can be connected to positions rather than personalities. What looks like a private gift may actually belong to a much larger institutional story. That is where Tom Bower's claim becomes explosive within this dramatized account. His suggestion threatens the assumption at the heart of the mystery, that the crown Meghan supposedly imagined in her future may never have been available to her in the first place. And that possibility cuts deeper than simple disappointment. Because losing something is painful. Discovering you were never truly in line to receive it is something else entirely. It forces every earlier moment to be reconsidered. Every expectation becomes uncertain. Every silence begins to feel loaded. The real shock, then, is not simply who the crown may ultimately belong to. It is why Meghan may have been excluded from its path long before she ever understood the rules governing it. And to understand why one crown could carry enough emotional weight to reopen years of royal tension, we have to return to the moment Meghan first entered a family where jewelry was never merely jewelry. Inside royal life, nobody needs to tell you where you stand. Sometimes the answer arrives in a seating plan, sometimes in a procession, and sometimes in diamonds. Meghan was entering a world where every jewel could whisper the one question nobody dared ask aloud: who truly belongs? For Meghan, that language may have been one of the hardest parts to read. She came from a world where achievement could be built, negotiated, reinvented. Royal life worked differently. Here, importance was not measured only by popularity, confidence, or public attention. It was shaped by birth, succession, seniority, duty, and customs so old that nobody inside the palace needed to explain them. And jewelry was part of that system. A piece could be personally owned, inherited privately, or merely loaned for a single appearance. That distinction mattered. Being allowed to wear something magnificent did not necessarily mean it had become yours, or that access would continue indefinitely. Yet from the outside, the difference could be almost impossible to see. That is where expectations could begin to grow. If Meghan was trusted with important pieces early in her royal life, those moments could easily have felt like signs of deeper acceptance. A borrowed tiara might appear to be more than a temporary gesture. A historic jewel could feel like an invitation into something permanent. But what one person saw as protocol, another could interpret as promise. The danger was in the silence between those meanings. As Meghan's profile grew, she became one of the most recognizable women in the royal family. But visibility and constitutional importance were not the same thing. The monarchy had another hierarchy beneath the headlines, one that quietly determined who moved closer to its most powerful symbols and who did not. Some jewels in this dramatized telling were effectively linked to roles rather than individuals. They belonged not to personality, but to position. And as the future of the monarchy became clearer, so too did the path of its most significant pieces. That path increasingly pointed toward Catherine. Not necessarily because she was more admired, more trusted, or more loved, but because her future role carried a different weight. The closer William moved toward the throne, the more Catherine's position became tied to continuity itself. For Meghan, that realization may have been the most difficult kind of rejection, the kind never spoken aloud. But among all those unspoken rules, one particular piece supposedly stood apart, and the closer Meghan came to understanding its history, the easier it may have been to imagine that one day, somehow, it could become hers. The crown looked like an inheritance waiting for a new chapter. Yet according to the explosive version of events surrounding it, its future may already have been decided before Meghan ever walked through palace gates, and the name silently connected to it was not hers. What made this piece so powerful was not simply its beauty. Its deeper value came from what it represented: seniority, continuity, and a place close to the center of royal power. In this world, certain jewels seemed to carry the memory of the women who had worn them before, appearing at moments of ceremony, transition, and dynastic importance. They did not simply decorate history. They appeared to move with it. That was the part outsiders could easily misunderstand. From a distance, it might seem natural to assume that treasured pieces passed according to affection. One royal woman favoring another, a beloved relative receiving something meaningful, a personal bond determining the next wearer. But within the monarchy, sentiment could be secondary. Rank mattered. Future responsibility mattered. The constitutional path of the family could matter most of all. And that path was beginning to place Catherine in an increasingly significant position. It did not mean the crown was formally hers. Not yet. But as William's future role became more important, Catherine's place beside him carried greater symbolic weight. The jewels associated with continuity would naturally become part of that conversation, whether anyone discussed it publicly or not. Meghan, however, had entered royal life through a different doorway. Marriage to Harry brought titles, prominence, access, and what may have seemed like permanent membership in the same ancient system. It would not have been difficult, in this dramatized account, to imagine that permanence eventually extending to the symbols of that world as well. But was that assumption ever corrected? That question changes everything, because if nobody directly explained which jewels followed rank, which followed role, and which were effectively moving toward another branch of the family, ambiguity could survive for years. And ambiguity is dangerous when hope is involved. A possibility can slowly become an expectation. An expectation can begin to feel like a promise. That is what makes Bower's supposed revelation so unsettling. The claim is not that Meghan came close to receiving the crown and then lost it after some private confrontation. The darker suggestion is that no sudden decision was required at all. Its future may have been written long before she arrived. If that was true, then Meghan had not lost the crown in some dramatic, last-minute palace confrontation. The more unsettling possibility was that she had never been in the line for it at all. Then came the detail that changed the entire story. In this dramatized account, Tom Bower's revelation was brutally simple. The crown Meghan supposedly imagined as part of her royal future was never being held for her. Palace tradition pointed somewhere else entirely. That was the turning point, because suddenly the mystery was no longer about whether Meghan had been denied a beautiful object. It was about whether she had misunderstood the structure that governed it from the beginning. According to this version of events, the crown's symbolic path was tied to something far more powerful than personal preference, the senior female role beside the future king. And that distinction made everything colder. If the crown followed constitutional position rather than affection, then there was almost nothing to negotiate. No private disappointment could change it. No wave of popularity could rewrite it. No emotional appeal could outrank succession. The rules were not personal, which somehow made them feel even more unforgiving. Years of speculation could suddenly be seen differently through that single detail. Moments that once looked like temporary hesitation might now appear permanent. Questions about access, status, and future ceremonial roles were no longer isolated mysteries. They became pieces of the same larger pattern. That is where private expectations become dangerous. A belief does not have to be formally promised to become emotionally real. If Meghan had come to imagine a certain place for herself inside the monarchy, then discovering that the institution had always drawn the map differently could feel like a betrayal, even if no promise had ever been made. Harry's position complicated that tension further. He had grown up inside the royal system, yet his emotional understanding of family did not always match the monarchy's rigid order of succession. Meghan, entering through marriage, may have seen their visibility and influence as signs of lasting importance. But the crown measures importance differently. It looks forward through heirs, roles, and continuity, and that brought Catherine sharply into focus. Her growing significance was not merely about public approval. Her position beside William placed her closer to the monarchy's future, and with that future came access to symbols that carried generations of institutional meaning. The uncomfortable question was whether Meghan ever believed that star power, public attention, or personal connection could bend traditions designed to survive individual personalities. And if the answer was yes, then the crown was only the beginning. Because once Meghan and Harry stepped away from royal duties, the question was no longer about one crown. It was about an entire treasury of symbols whose doors may have quietly begun closing behind them. There was no dramatic ceremony marking the change. No velvet case slammed shut. No public declaration announced what Meghan could never wear again. Yet after the Sussex departure, the invisible rules surrounding royal jewels suddenly mattered more than ever, and silence became its own answer. The crown was no longer the only symbol hanging over the story. Once Meghan and Harry stepped away from frontline royal duties, access itself became the deeper issue. Royal jewelry was tied to a world of state occasions, formal engagements, palace invitations, and ceremonial responsibilities. Without those roles, the opportunities to enter that world began to shrink. That distinction was crucial. Many of the monarchy's most important pieces were not simply personal possessions waiting to be divided among relatives. They belonged to the monarch, the institution, or a tradition that determined when and why they could be worn. Access came with position. Position came with duty. And duty had changed. In this dramatized telling, The emotional impact was not necessarily about losing diamonds. It was about watching an entire symbolic language continue without you. The same ceremonies still happened. The same historic jewels still emerged. The same traditions moved forward. But Meghan was no longer standing inside the structure that gave those objects their meaning. Meanwhile, Catherine's role was moving in the opposite direction. With each major state occasion, her place in the monarchy became more pronounced. Historic pieces appeared around the woman whose future was increasingly tied to the crown itself. It would have been easy for observers to reduce that contrast to rivalry, but the reality was more unsettling because it appeared structural. Catherine did not need to take anything from Meghan. The hierarchy simply kept carrying her forward. That made the situation almost impossible to challenge. Every significant royal appearance could now serve as a reminder of a path Meghan might once have imagined for herself, not because she necessarily wanted every necklace, tiara, or gemstone, but because those objects represented something far more difficult to replace: acknowledgement from the institution. Outside royal life, Meghan could build influence on her own terms. She could create distance, independence, and an identity no palace could dictate. Yet independence came with a cost. The monarchy's deepest symbols remained attached to the roles she had left behind. And soon, one royal appearance would make that reality feel sharper than ever. And then came the appearance that transformed an abstract hierarchy into something impossible to ignore. Because Catherine did not need to say a word for the jewels around her to deliver the message. One appearance was enough to ignite the comparison. Catherine stepped forward carrying the visual language of continuity, historic stones, inherited symbolism, the confidence of a woman moving closer to the monarchy's center. For Meghan, the most uncomfortable part may not have been what Catherine wore, but what it announced. By this point, Catherine's use of significant royal jewelry no longer looked accidental. Each important piece seemed to place her more firmly inside the institution's future. In royal life, clothing and jewels can speak long before titles formally change. A borrowed necklace can signal trust. A historic tiara can connect the present to generations of queens, and when those symbols gather around one person repeatedly, the message becomes difficult to ignore. Catherine was moving toward the center. Meghan, meanwhile, had chosen a very different path. Outside the working monarchy, she had freedom from palace expectations, greater control over her public identity, and the ability to shape her own future. Yet that independence also meant watching another woman step deeper into a world Meghan had once occupied herself. That contrast carried emotional weight, because seeing someone else wear historic jewels is one thing. Seeing them inhabit the role those jewels represent is something far more powerful. Public fascination only intensified the effect. Every major piece Catherine wore invited speculation. Was it approval? Preparation? A quiet promotion without words? Royal watchers searched for meaning in every stone, every inherited ornament, every connection to earlier generations. And suddenly, the crown at the center of Bower's supposed revelation no longer seemed like an isolated mystery. It looked like part of a chain, one symbol leading to another, one role becoming clearer, one future taking shape through tradition rather than announcement. The more Catherine's position strengthened, the harder it became to frame the situation as a personal contest between two women. The monarchy did not need to punish Meghan for leaving. It simply needed to continue doing what it had always done: protect succession, preserve hierarchy, and pass its symbols toward the roles designed to carry them forward. That possibility was colder than rivalry. Because rivalry suggests a contest can still be won, structure does not. And that left one deeply uncomfortable question hanging over everything. What happens when someone who once stood inside the royal machine realizes that the machine can continue, perfectly and publicly, without them? That realization would turn the crown from a beautiful object into something far more dangerous, a symbol of the one thing neither wealth, fame, nor independence could reproduce outside palace walls. Perhaps the deepest wound was never about diamonds. A crown can be replicated, jewels can be purchased, glamour can be rebuilt anywhere. But there is one thing money cannot manufacture: centuries of institutional recognition, and that may be what this royal object truly represented. That is why the story becomes more complicated than simple envy. Meghan could leave royal life and still remain famous. She could build influence, create projects, shape her own image, and speak without the same palace restrictions. But celebrity and dynasty are not the same kind of power. One is created in the present. The other is inherited from the past and reinforced by an institution built to outlast individual personalities. The crown, then, may have represented far more than possession. It could have symbolized a future in which Meghan remained permanently tied to the monarchy's inner circle. A future where her place was not merely public, but historical. Walking away from that system brought freedom. It also meant surrendering access to the symbols that made royal status different from ordinary fame. That tension is where the emotional conflict deepens. Choosing independence does not erase the meaning of what was left behind. A person can believe a decision was necessary and still feel the weight of the doors that closed afterward. In this dramatized account, the crown becomes a symbol of that alternate life, the path not taken, the role never fully occupied. Harry faced a parallel contradiction. He was born inside the institution, shaped by its rituals and expectations, yet no longer stood at its operational center. For him, the distance was not from something unfamiliar. It was from something that had once defined his entire world. And still, the monarchy continued. Titles shifted. Ceremonies returned. Jewels passed into new hands. Traditions moved forward with almost mechanical calm. That permanence sharpened the contrast with Catherine. Her advantage was not necessarily greater affection, greater popularity, or some hidden personal victory. It was structural. Her place beside William connected her directly to the future of the crown. And that is where the meaning of the mysterious piece changed again. Because if the crown was tied not simply to Catherine as an individual, but to the senior royal role she was moving toward, then its ultimate purpose may have been far greater than Meghan ever imagined. And that is where Bower's revelation becomes even more devastating. Because the crown's future may not end with Catherine wearing it. It may be tied to the very moment the monarchy enters its next era. The final truth of the crown is colder than rivalry. It does not choose favorites, it follows power. If its path was always connected to the future queen, then Meghan was not defeated by Catherine, palace aides, or whispered opposition. She was confronting something far older than all of them. That changes the meaning of the entire story. Royal regalia does not move according to private wishes. It follows office, succession, and institutional purpose. A crown may carry emotion, memory, and personal association, but its deepest meaning comes from the role it serves. And that is why Catherine became the natural center of speculation. As William moved closer to the throne, Catherine's future position beside him gave her a place within the monarchy that no amount of public attention could imitate. The jewels connected to continuity would naturally gather around the woman expected to represent that continuity in the next era. For Meghan, that made the alleged expectation painfully incompatible with the structure itself. What may once have seemed possible now looked like something the institution was never designed to offer her. The conflict, then, was never simply Meghan versus Catherine. It was Meghan versus the logic of monarchy. Meghan represented a more modern idea of identity, one built through personal choice, reinvention, and self-definition. The monarchy operates differently. Birth matters, succession matters, duty matters. The individual may shape the role, but the role exists before the individual arrives. That is what gives Bower's supposed revelation its dramatic force. It exposes the distance between personal expectation and institutional reality. One side may imagine possibility. The other sees precedent. And once Meghan and Harry stepped away from royal duties, every future milestone changed meaning. Coronations, state events, inherited jewels, and ceremonial honors were no longer symbols they would naturally move toward. They became reminders of a structure continuing without them. But one question refuses to disappear. Did Meghan simply misunderstand what the crown represented? Or did the palace allow an assumption to survive because nobody wanted to confront it? That distinction matters. Because there is a difference between being wrong and being left to believe something that was never true. And behind closed doors, nobody outside the people involved can know what was actually discussed, promised, hinted at, assumed, or never explained at all. Yet one final question remains. Because royal history is filled with misunderstandings that became feuds precisely because nobody spoke openly. And if Meghan truly believed the crown was within reach, someone had to know that belief existed. The most unsettling part of this story may be the silence. If Meghan truly imagined that crown in her future, when did the palace realize it? Who knew the expectation existed? And why, in a family obsessed with protocol, would such a powerful misunderstanding ever be allowed to survive? Perhaps that is the real weakness hidden inside institutions built on tradition. The people born into them learn the rules almost without being taught. They understand which roles carry which privileges, which symbols belong to which future, and which boundaries are never meant to be crossed. But for someone arriving from outside, those same rules can feel invisible. And invisible rules can become dangerous. What seems obvious to insiders may look deliberately concealed to somebody who was never given the same map. A silence meant as formality can feel like avoidance. An assumption can become a promise in the mind of someone trying to understand where they belong. Then, when reality finally arrives, disappointment can harden into suspicion. That is why the crown became more than jewelry in this dramatized account. It became a symbol of everything that was never clearly said. Meghan's life now exists far from that old structure. She has independence, commercial freedom, and control over her own direction. Catherine's future, by contrast, is becoming more ceremonial, more institutional, and increasingly tied to the next chapter of the monarchy. Two women, two paths, two very different definitions of power. And still, the crown moves according to its own logic. It does not respond to hurt feelings, public arguments, or changing headlines. Its meaning is tied to continuity. And continuity is exactly what the monarchy protects most fiercely. That is why Bower's supposed revelation carries such force in the story. It takes years of tension and reduces them to one haunting symbol, a crown one woman may have imagined within reach, while the institution quietly understood it belonged to another future entirely. Perhaps that is where the deepest royal conflicts begin, not with what someone is denied, but with what they believed had already been promised. And somewhere behind palace doors, the crown remains where it has always been, silent, guarded, and waiting for history to decide who wears it next, while the question of who once believed it was theirs refuses to disappear.